Tonight we have John Ambrosiano presenting Faith Beyond Belief, the remarkable relationship between spirituality and religion. And he writes, every faith offers its members meaningful beliefs as well as deep spiritual insights. Differences in belief tend to separate people, in part because we are part of one's social identity. However, despite differences in belief, the spiritual insights described by mystics of different faiths are remarkably similar. A sense of oneness, a feeling of awe of being alive, an altruistic love for others, and a deeply intuitive moral sensibility. People from different faiths often argue over beliefs, but mystics from those same traditions get along quite well. We will talk about the remarkable relationship between spirituality and belief, in part by exploring key findings from the social sciences. Dr. John Ambrosiano received his PhD in physics from the College of William and Mary in 1980 and worked as a computational scientist at both the Livermore and Los Alamos National Laboratories. In 2005, he began pursuing an interest in Buddhism, which he now teaches at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Los Alamos. He retired from LANL, but remains a laboratory guest. These days, he mostly spends his time fishing, writing talks, teaching, painting, and feeding horses.
That's the one that I can't forget. Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you for coming to these summer talks. Can you hear me well enough? I'm very soft-spoken.
Can you move that mic up all the way to the top of your collar?
Oh, okay, just a second. Let me do it for you, since it's hard to see her. Okay. Do you think that's better?
Is it better? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay. So, again, thank you for coming, and welcome to the series. I started this with an interest of mine that was kindled by my Buddhist teacher. He was very interested in awakening in general, not just what Buddhists thought about it. He made a wonderful film at just about the time that I asked him to be my teacher. That was a story too, because he initially said that he didn't have room for any more students. But I had been to a retreat where he had let slip that his teacher from Sri Lanka once answered a question of his where he said, well, Bhante, what do I do if somebody asks to be a student? He says, Matt, you say yes. So he was, he had to take me on. So from Matt, I learned a lot about this sort of universality of religious experience, religious mystical experience, which surprised me at first. But he taught that in a very effective way by teaching not just Buddhist scriptures, but the Tao and wisdom teachings from Jewish traditions and all sorts of places. So I kind of owe my perspective on this to him, so I'll share that with you. And he created a really wonderful film with his wife Carol in 2009 called With One Voice. It talks about the universality of the mystical experience. And that's something I'll play about a 10-minute clip from that later on, so you can hear what mysticism is from mystics. All right, so the first thing I want to ask you is, why are you here? I mean, that's the question I ask myself every time I stand in front of the refrigerator. You may have come here because the topic sounded interesting, because you're interested in either faith or religion and wanted to sort of see how those line up. You may have come because your spouse told you to come. As we get sort of down the list, we start to see how people share meaning in their lives. Because that's what we want to talk about first, is what's meaningful for us. And we know that religion is very meaningful for many people. It doesn't matter what denomination it is. So, meaning comes from community as well as from what individuals find meaningful. And that's actually something that philosophers and social scientists have studied. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. If you keep asking yourself, why am I here? Eventually you'll get down to this question as the ultimate existential question. Why am I here? What am I doing here? What am I for? What's my purpose? And often people answer that when they discover a faith that they are devoted to. But it can come in a lot of different ways. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So I guess I don't really need to look at my notes. So I'm gonna work without a net here. So yeah. Okay. So how human beings find meaning was a really strong interest of Viktor Frankl, the psychologist. He was also a Holocaust survivor, and he lost pretty much his whole family in the Holocaust. He found that for himself and for others that were in the concentration camp, that it was possible to find meaning in the direst circumstances. He said, what matters is not, he says, life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose. And he said, what matters is not the meaning of life in general, which we all know is 42. I'll explain that in the breakout sessions. But he said that what matters is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. He invented a therapy called logotherapy, and where logo stands for a lot of things if you ask the Greeks, but in this case it stands for meaning and intention. And it is a very effective therapy. People are asked to talk about what's meaningful for them. And often they find meaning and purpose that way. So philosophers have a lot to say about everything that we consider worthwhile. And I love philosophers. I'm not having a joke on them. So the nature of meaning for the individual is something that philosophers think about. At the turn of the century, we had the emergence of the existentialists. So there was a phase, where the philosophy was pragmatism, rational thought, and existentialists like Søren Kierkegaard said that actually meaning is not something that's abstract, or there are no innate meanings anywhere in anything, that human beings create meaning for themselves. That's the way an existentialist would look at it, because existentialism is all about the subjective, the experience of being alive. And so, he says, this is how human beings find meaning. Everyone has meaning at an individual level that's meaningful for them, and as well as a sense of purpose. So that's how the existentialists thought about it. Then the phenomenologists come along and they say, well, that's kind of, inexact. We need to really study experience in a much more systematic way. And Husserl is one of the phenomenologists that it made a mark in understanding our subjective experience. And his way of looking at meaning is that he said that every act of consciousness actually is an opportunity to find meaning in something. That makes sense, right? Because it's all about the subjective. So every subjective act of consciousness is an opportunity to find meaning. And meaning is always about something. Okay, it's not just kind of floating around. So meaning is about something. So the example I'll use here is there's an old tree. And what happens is whenever we have a conscious experience about something, there's an intention that is directed towards that object. It's not an intention to do anything with it. He was very clear about that. It's not a matter of what's it good for. Okay, but there's just a movement in the mind that says this is meaningful. I need to pay attention to it. And so, for example, if I happened on an old tree, I might say, that's a really nice tree. It has lovely shade. I'd really like to come back and sit under it and read. Okay. So in that context, you have created meaning for a tree. Now, the guy who's walking next to me would say, well, might make really nice firewood. That's different meaning for them. So Husserl, sort of inspired by the existentialists and others, pursued this idea of phenomenology, characterizing what the subjective experience is like. And then people read that. And one of the people that was inspired by Husserl is a sociologist named Schutz. And Dr. Schutz said that not only is there a conscious process by which we make meaning for ourselves individually, but it's possible for social groups to find meaning for the group. And what he did is he read Husserl and he said, well, I don't see anything here that says a group couldn't do this, but we have to have some way that they can share their subjective experience. Okay, so by sharing things that we all share from time to time, we create something that Schutz called intersubjectivity. Okay, so it's the sort of collective subjectivity of the group. Okay, and that's how he said societies create meaning. It's how football teams create meaning. It's how, you name it. You've been there. So what we, of course, want to know a little more about is how people find meaning in religion. What kind of thing is that? What are the things that people find meaningful in religion? The world's religions, especially the ones that are considered the top 4 or top 5, are incredibly enduring. I mean, they've been around for a really long time. And they change, but slowly over time. They don't change abruptly. How does that work? Well, they draw on this, through the group, they draw on this phenomenon of intersubjectivity, and but they also create something to go with that. They create beliefs, or they find, let's say find, because I don't want I have to be careful. I don't want people to think I'm saying this is all, made up, and because some people believe that. They believe that the subjective is not real. Okay, and so the people who believe the subjective is not real says, well, there's nothing out there. Okay, there are others that say, well, everything is real. So I just wanted to mention that because I'm not going to question anyone's beliefs or their observances, religious observances. I'm just going to say that's a characteristic of religion. The person who really drove that home was a fellow named Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim was really interested in finding what he considered to be the core principles of religion. Now, if you're a scientist, you can identify with this idea of trying to reduce something to its absolute essentials and then allowing other things to be layered on top of that. Okay. So what did he do? Well, he studied the oldest societies that he could find that had a religion, and it happened to be, for him, the Australian Aborigines. And they had what was called totem worship, but it's actually a very bad term for what they did. They weren't worshiping the totem. What the totem was the symbol of their tribe. Every tribe had a different totem. Every clan had a different totem. And the totem represented the tribe. So if they were worshiping anything, they were worshiping the tribe. Okay, this is something that some modern religions, I think, miss because they consider it idolatry. So what's up with these guys? It's a piece of wood. What's up with that? But it really goes deeper than that. So he was criticized for that. So he observed some things that he considered to be core principles of religion. And some people said, well, you're studying, Aborigines. I mean, come on. So some people just didn't take him seriously because he wasn't studying modern religions. But modern religions, were modern, might still be 2,000 years old, have a lot layered on them. They're very complex cultural phenomena. So he said, look, I'll do what I do. I'm going to look at what these primitive societies do when they create a religious community, and then we'll go from there. He did feel like these principles explained why religions were so enduring. One of the things that he did not consider was mysticism or mystery of any kind or any unseen reality, because he just didn't. Okay, I don't know why exactly. Maybe he was trying to be scientific. So the thing that we often think about when we think of religion, which is belief in God or some unifying principle, was absent in his discussion. But what he did find was this, that every religion maintains its identity by creating two groups of things. Okay, so there's the sacred. So there are sacred objects, there are sacred beliefs, there are sacred rites and rituals. Okay, those are sacred. Everything else is profane. Okay, and there's kind of a harmless view of that, which is everything else is profane, but we can still go dancing. We like our worldliness. We enjoy it. Or they could be forbidden. The profane could be taboo. And usually what he found is that it's a mix of both, right? But the sacred is always held at a distance from the profane. So he said, in all the history of human thought, there exists no other example of two categories of things so profoundly differentiated and so radically opposed to one another. So it's the sacred that the religious communities identify with. Beliefs, rituals, rites. And that's what forms the religious community. So he explained how these things bring communities together and keep them together. But he also believed that morality was kind of a natural home for religion. It's necessary but not sufficient. I forget which way it goes. But the morality is something that anyone can develop as part of their understanding of the world. But it's a natural home for religion because there are things that are sacred. He also believed that it's the community. Remember, the totem worshippers weren't worshiping the totem, they were worshiping the community, or they were honoring the community. So he believed that for them, the community is bigger than the individual. It's the community that it confers a sense of something bigger than oneself. And we'll come up on that when we talk about mysticism later. So he didn't talk about mystery or the supernatural as being necessary for religion. Now we come to William James. So we've moved from sociology to psychology. This is a remarkable man. I mean, I don't know anybody who's read anything he's written that doesn't think he's a remarkable person. He was a philosopher. He basically invented modern psychology. I mean, it's changed a lot, but the bones of it are still where he laid them. And among other things, and he invented a philosophy called pragmatism. He's all about the subjective. He's a psychologist. He wants to know how the mind works, but not the way, Skinnerians do it. He's not just saying, oh, well, he pressed the button, I don't know why, but that's what he did. He wants to know what that subjective experience is, how it feels. And in the case of religion, he wants to know how religion feels for the individual, because that's where you start. He defined religion in this way. He said, in a famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he said, religion shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitudes. It includes women as well, I'm sure. He's very broad-minded. Shall mean the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. So this sort of common feature of so Durkheim just kind of blew this off, right? But William James recognizes that there is a sense of the divine, a sense of the sublime that we all carry in our hearts. And I'm not just saying that to be sentimental. I really believe that's true. He said, he talked about the reality of the unseen. So for him, so the subjective is real. There are people who will argue that, but mystics don't. They believe that the subjective is real, because that's what they're experiencing. There's this tendency to say that the subjective experience is not real, but it is real. So he says, the reality of the unseen I shall not dispute. The whole universe of concrete objects as we know them swims in a wider and higher universe of abstract ideas, and these ideas, though unseen, are real. So the Varieties is a remarkable book. The way he frames the religious experience, he starts out by talking about two personalities, two temperaments. And it's really interesting that he does that. He basically says, well, you know, we have to talk about who's experiencing what. And so he identified, and this is from his research, by the way. He just didn't, he's not Freud, you know. I was watching a lecture on the varieties and on William James, and the guy said that there was a dinner where James hosted both Freud and Jung, and he spent his entire dinner with Jung, and left Freud sitting in a corner. So he identified these two archetypes. One is called the healthy-minded. So the healthy-minded is a person who has a cheerful temperament. They may have thoughts of evil, but they don't linger. Or they may deliberately turn away from it. I mean, I know you have friends. We all do who are like that. Walt Whitman is, he cited several examples, but Walt Whitman is one of the people who exemplify this archetype of the healthy-minded. And if you read his poetry, you know that he's a wonderful admirer of nature. Some people who have asked what religion he had hear the word pagan, and they don't know what to make of it. But basically, he just thought nature was magnificent. And so this is an example that happens to be quoted in the Varieties as well. It says, "I think I could turn and live with animals. They're so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. No one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. And not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth." He's an optimist, right? Yeah. So my wife is like Walt Whitman. It's a great gift to me that I have lived with this cheerful person. Okay, the other archetype is the opposite. So what he does is he poses these opposite poles. Now everybody is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? But you can also think of people that you've either read about or experienced in some way that are one of these two archetypes in the extreme. So this is one of the ones he cites for what he calls the sick soul, okay? And he describes it as pessimistic and restless. These people see their life as flawed, painful, and they're constantly torn between good and evil. Leo Tolstoy is an exemplar, and this is from his book called "The Kingdom of God is Within You." So this is kind of a criticism of Tolstoy's of mankind and its ways of not living up to the ideal that was preached by Christ. And this is typical of what's in the book. It says, if there were no external means of dulling their sensibilities, half of mankind would shoot themselves without delay. For to live in opposition to one's reason is the most intolerable condition. And that is the condition of all men of the present day. All men of the modern world exist in a state of continual and flagrant antagonism between their conscience and their way of life. Actually, he wasn't depressed a lot of the time, I'm told, but he did have a very cynical view of human nature. So, if we continue with this particular archetype, the sick soul, what we find is that there are people who have this leaning, emotional leaning, and they are also religious, or at least they have some principles, ideals that they try to live by. And it's a struggle because, sometimes they're true to these ideals and sometimes they're not true to them. Sometimes they're, saints and sometimes they're sinners. And that's not necessarily a problem unless you see it as a problem, unless it has that, you have that sense that, this is intolerable, I can't live this way. James said that of what he calls the divided self, the higher and lower feelings, the useful and the erring impulses, begin by being a comparative chaos within us. The man's interior is a battleground for what he feels to be two deadly hostile selves, one actual and the other ideal. Okay, so James actually has a lot of examples of religious experience and religious people. Since he lived in a culture that was mostly Christian, then there are a lot of examples here from Christianity, but this could apply to anyone. So it was St. Augustine that he talked about at one point. And the interesting about St. Augustine is that he was a Christian, but not necessarily, a practicing Christian. This is attributed to him. He says, "Give me chastity and continence, O Lord, but not yet." Okay, and this is his quote that he cites for when he was really torn by this divided nature. He said, "The new will which I began to have was not yet strong enough to overcome the other will, strengthened by long indulgence. So these two wills, the old one and the new, one carnal, the other spiritual, contended with each other and disturbed my soul." So that's the divided self. But it got better. So the story of Augustine's conversion is actually what I interpret as what's called an awakening experience. Okay, and I'll talk more about that. And it can happen to anyone, any religion, anytime. It can happen unexpectedly. It can happen after a long period of devotion and practice. It's a mystery. Okay? And so what happened with Augustine is he was minding his own business in this garden in Milan, enjoying where he was. And then as he reports it, he heard the voice of a young child saying something to the effect of, "Take and read, take and read." Now, he didn't talk to the child, but what it did is it caused him to have an awakening in which he felt he had to pick up his New Testament. And he picked it up and he turned it to a passage at random. And he woke up. He said, and I forget which one it was, but it almost doesn't matter. He said, "I had no wish to read further and no need, for instantly it was as though the light of certainty flooded my heart, and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled." So James describes what I call an awakening, what he called a conversion process. He described it as a surrender to the reality of the unseen. So this is what happens, what people typically report in an awakening experience, is there comes, you sort of start out, it's all about you, your life, your problems, your tensions, your misgivings about one thing or another, and then suddenly something shifts. And you goes away, maybe just for an instant, but you get to see the ultimate reality. You get to see the life itself. I'm not going to go on about it. It just gets weird, but he said it was like a passage from the everlasting no to the everlasting yes. Okay, so this was a man who had a divided self because he had a concubine. I mean, he liked sex. So, he's trying to be idealistic about it, but, give me continence, but not yet, oh Lord. But then it's just not about him anymore. It's just not. So this was his conversion. So the way my teacher described it to us from time to time is as an analogy, something that he called the figure ground shift. So what happens is you're all about yourself or your small things in your life, and all of a sudden you see that there's a bigger reality. And it's like this illusion. So I know you've seen this. It's actually called Rubens vase. And so if you look at it one way, it looks like a profile of two people. If you look at it another way, it looks like a vase. Okay, and it's actually considered by psychologists to be what they call a bistable image. So you can't not see them. There's no holistic view of it. It's just either a vase or it's two people, and it just kind of flashes back and forth. The thing that makes this not quite a good analogy to awakening is that you do have this dualism that you're dealing with. Is it a vase? Is it faces? Is it a vase? Is it faces? Awakening is when you just awake to the fact that it's all fine. It doesn't matter if it's a face or it's a vase. You can transcend that. You can hold both of those things in your mind at the same time. You can hold both of them in your heart at the same time. Your mind's still going face to face, face to face. And what happens when that happens is that you awaken to what's called unity consciousness. So you don't see life as populated by a bunch of little things, you see it as a whole. So James did talk about mysticism a little bit, and I think he got it right. He said he believed that religious experience, not religious beliefs, although they support, So one thing I want to make clear about this talk is that I'm not saying that you should have no religious beliefs. The religious beliefs support a community and which creates a safe space for you to contemplate who you are. And that's one of the things that religion does for you. It also helps to maintain social order, morality, all of those things that people find beneficial. So it supports an awakening experience. It's just not the same as. So James believed that ultimately the religious experience is rooted in mystical states of consciousness, and that it has certain qualities. The first one is why it's called mystical, because you can't describe it. So a mystical experience can't be expressed in words. Now I'm going to run a film clip where that's exactly what people do. But what happens is when the experience occurs, time is suspended. All ideas are suspended. There are no ideas to draw on to describe the experience. But what happens is your mind comes in. By the way, your mind can't wake you up. You can't think your way to awakening. And that's because all the mind ever does is say, I'm thinking about this thing as opposed to that thing. So everything you think is what we call a duality. You can't think about anything without creating dualities. Even if you say, no, I'm thinking about this thing, which is, well, what's that other thing over there? Well, I'm not thinking about that. Well, you are. Okay? So that's why the mind is not a good tool for experiencing wholeness, because it's always dividing. That's the simplest way to put it. It always divides experience. It always shatters experience. It can't do anything else. But there are other faculties of mind that come in and say, well, let's just listen for a minute. Yeah, just be here. the great teacher Ram Dass wrote a book. His first book was called Be Here Now. That's it. So ineffability is one of them. A noetic quality. So noetic is the root of that is knowledge. So it's something that feels deeply true. Okay. Now you can try to explain why it's true, but then you'll run into the first problem. So it just feels, it's heartfelt. It feels deeply true. It feels like the experience is meaningful, but it's not sustainable. Right? So the mind comes back and says, okay, what happened? That's where the explanations and the descriptions of the experience will come in for the mystics that you hear later. Whenever someone has an experience like that, it makes an impression. And that impression is deeply felt. And then the mind comes back and says, well, what just happened? So my teacher had a sudden awakening when he was in his 30s. He wasn't a Buddhist. He was a psychologist. He was reading self-help books, trying to figure out what to do with his life. He was driving down the road, and then he realized he had to pull over because something was happening. And he found himself out of time. I mean, not like I'm out of time in a few minutes, but just out of time. And when he found the words to express it, he said, in that moment I realized that who I am has never been born and will never die. And then he spent 40 years trying to figure out what to do with that. But he ran into a wonderful teacher that took him in hand. So it's not sustainable, and it's passive. These are all consistent with what I've learned elsewhere. It's not under voluntary control. Okay, so one of the sayings in Buddhism is about meditation or awakening is that waking up is an accident, and all you can do with all these practices like meditation and so on is to make yourself accident prone. Okay, so just a word about saints. Okay, so you know that we talked about the divided self, we talked about unification, we talked about the conversion process. Many times actually, the person goes back to this sort of sick soul experience that they had, but they're changed, right? If they're in their quiet moments, they say, well, come on, you know better than that, right? But they're still troubled. But there are some that James calls saints whose confidence is so strong that they may have doubts from time to time, but it doesn't matter. They're completely confident in their conversion to whatever it is. So this is how Saint Teresa of Avila described it. She said, as she continued her prayer, so for Saint Teresa of Avila, her contemplative practice was prayer. And it was prayer, if I understand it correctly, it was prayer that she had to kind of make for herself because women were not allowed to pray at the time. I don't know if you've ever heard that story. There was a time when she lived where you had to have a priest around if you were going to pray because the devil is, I'm not going to even say that. It's crazy. But she became a very devoted mystic. And she described a continued deepening, a union with the divine. She said, God dwelt within me, giving her a spiritual sweetness beyond description. So this is ecstasy. Now, she says further, now the soul cannot doubt. She, that's her soul, sees herself in God and God in her in such a way that she cannot separate the two. So this is talked about by St. John of the Cross and other saints who describe, St. John of the Cross is where what was it called? The dark night of the soul, yeah. So he had this divided self-experience. He just stuck with it, and he said, I know that this faith is real, and he experienced an awakening as well. So, now I'm going to let you hear from mystics about their own experience. I think I am. So, let's try it.
I was very successful with a few businesses that I started in a very short span of time. And when everything that you touch is successful, the planet doesn't go around the sun, it goes around you. The town where I lived in India is a small hill. So one afternoon I just went and sat there. My eyes were still open. Till that moment I always knew myself as this is me, that is somebody else. Suddenly I did not know which is me and which is not me. What was me was all over the place. The very rock on which I was sitting, the air that I was breathing, the atmosphere around me, everything had become me. For the first time in my adult life, there were tears in my eyes, to a point where my shirt is wet. I've always been peaceful and happy, that's never been an issue for me. But this was something else. I was bursting with a completely different kind of blissfulness and ecstasy, which my body couldn't hold.
I come out of 19 years as an alcoholic and a drug addict. That obsession that had been with me for so many years that drove me to drink a fifth of alcohol every day and do a gram of cocaine every day just to get through the day, that disappeared in a heartbeat. And I wasn't happy about it. I wasn't trying to get sober, I wasn't looking to get sober, I didn't like people who were sober, I didn't associate with people who were sober, I didn't want to be one of those people. And yet it happened. And in that moment, a profound kind of transformation occurred, because up until that point, I was convinced that I was the master of my destiny, that I was making the choices, I was making the decisions, I was making it happen, I was responsible. And clearly, I hadn't done this. And yet, I was totally transformed. And in that understanding, in the seeing, in the most profound way, that it was the universe that was acting, and not me as an individual, there was freedom. There was peace. And it was the peace that surpasses all understanding.
I was walking home alone at night and looked up at the stars. So that night I had sort of reached a point of despair, and I looked up at the stars and I said, Marcel, don't kid yourself. Those stars are millions of light years away. There's no connection between me and them. And then my perception changed. It just transformed. And suddenly I experienced that the stars were inside of me, that I was inside of the stars, and that we were part of a oneness. And then I experienced or understood that everything was part of that oneness. And I experienced this sense of this light that was infusing everything and flowing through everything, through this oneness that everything is. And it was this incredible power. I felt this power, which I understand now to be the power of that divine or that oneness, that eternal being. But it was a power so strong, I felt that it could heal any problem on earth, that no problem on earth was too big for this power that could heal anything.
The great white eagle came and said, "Come," and flew me to the highest of heavens. But I looked back. All I could see was a little dot. That was Mother Earth. And this cosmos was the magnitude of this essence of life I talk about.
I was in the Peace Corps at the time. I was teaching English in Bangkok. And I had a friend, and we were both just beginning our exploration of Buddhism. And we were just sitting in his garden one afternoon, and he was reading from a Tibetan text called the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. And he was just reading the text, and I was sitting there. My mind happened to be very still and very concentrated. And in one of the lines refers to it as unborn. So the word unborn was, and somehow just conditions came together, and just on hearing the word unborn, it's like something happened. You know, it was like the unborn borned. For, you know, it was just a split second, but it was like a kind of a lightning bolt, right? That just totally reorganized my understanding of things.
It was rush hour, so cars were all over the place. You smelled the pollution coming from their exhaust, the noise. So I'm walking, and that's the scene for a few moments, and then, without any forethought on my part, without any effort whatsoever, totally unexpected, everything switched. Everything changed in an instant. The peace, the perfection, the unity, the light that is the basis and the underlying support for all of this came forward. And all the activity, the noise, the names, the forms, everything took on sort of almost like a wavy reality and shifted backwards. It was there, but it didn't really matter. What mattered, what was most present, was this peace, this unshakable peace. Everywhere I looked, everywhere, there was just peace, peace, and peace.
Even though the mystic paths are living within the traditional religion, they go beyond it. They have much more of an understanding of their unity because they are addressing the human heart.
When I speak of mysticism, I mean the experience. It's always an experience. It's not just something to talk about or read about. It's an experience, and it is an experience of unity and communion, and a communion with ultimate reality.
I mean, it's a loose term, like many spiritual terms. But what it means is that dimension of our being which is transcendent, which is utterly unlimited, which is outside of time, outside of the realm of form, outside of any kind of duality. The way I would use the word would be one which leads to at least an intuition, if not a full awakening to that transcendent quality of our own being.
For me, it means a non-conceptual experience which is direct and intuitive and not mediated by reason or reflection, and which often is contrary to things that we previously believed or took for granted.
Whether we know it or not, we're always that creative source. We can't be anything else. Not only we can't be anything else, there's nothing else.
There seems to be a direct experience with something that is luminous and expansive and has no boundaries. And there seems to be some aspect of the human mind when we are able to drop our thoughts and just simply be with what is, there seems to be some kind of commonality that crosses over all traditional lines.
Once you get to the mystical level, you go beyond the differences that the different scriptures or dogmas or traditions present. You go to the underlying unity.
At that time, we don't have a discursive mind around, and we don't even have an ego around.
It is not something that you attain. It is something that you merge with. It is something that you become.
You are talking about an experience in which the I-ness of man has totally disappeared, and therefore he doesn't talk about himself or anything else but God. He doesn't see anything else but God.
So we would say in Christian mysticism that God in us is recognizing God in others.
All of the trappings, the clothing we wear, where we come from, how we speak, what language we use, it all falls away for mystics. There seems to be a universal, I would say, a universal fragrance to mysticism. So one of the ways I'm sometimes asked, what does it mean to be a mystic? Or what is a mystical teaching? The image I often use is a rose, that I can talk till I'm blue in the face for the next 100 years on what a rose smells like. And it's not going to be understood. But if I hand somebody a rose and say, smell this, and they smell it, we now have a commonality that we can speak about. And this is what the mystical experience is like.
Okay. So, that was the wrong way.
I was very successful.
Stop. There. Okay. So, mystics from all traditions report these kinds of experiences. You hear the words selflessness, so self disappeared. You hear the word unity. You hear peace and love. But what I haven't heard yet is that it's often described as coming home. So what you're discovering is something essential about your own nature when you have these experiences. And it feels ultimately peaceful, ultimately comfortable. It feels like coming home. And so I'll end the talk with this quote from T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Thank you.
Okay, we'll have a time of questions. And go ahead. I'll pass the mic to you if this thing is working.
Yes.
Can I just make a comment? That was a
Sure.
really good talk.
Oh, thanks.
About St. Teresa not being able to come up with her own prayers. That was across the board.
Oh, I see. Well, that's an opportunity for the devil, right? I mean, the devil's waiting for that opportunity.
She was living at a time with mental problems, not heard of.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when I made that comment about the devil, I was thinking that's what the Inquisitor would say. Yeah. That statue by Bernini is very famous. I don't know if you've noticed it.
It's not on.
Yeah.
It's called transverberation. You see the spirit going in.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a recognized.
But it got a lot of attention because Bernini portrayed ecstasy in a very particular way. It was yeah, a little racy. Yes.
It was a very interesting talk and a lot to think about. However, I was thinking about the fact that we're the Faith and Science Forum, and I didn't hear any science.
Well, that was the sociology. It was all soft.
Well, if you want to call sociology science. One of the questions you might ask yourself is the fact that, 500,000 years or so ago, 100,000 years or so ago, apes, hominid apes, turned into Homo sapiens. And that means that Homo sapiens is very, very much like all those other apes that we don't think of as being spiritual. And so what has happened with Homo sapiens is that's, in fact, from a scientific viewpoint, you can explain that duality you were talking about, that we tend to move along just like all the other hominids and everything else, look for food, look for mates, look for everything else, and act in our own best interest. But for some reason, humans are looking at that other part that ends in mysticism And I was hoping you would discuss some of that.
Well, there's a problem talking about the subjective life of apes because I'm only kind of marginally an ape. There's a famous essay by a psychologist called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" And the answer is you don't know. You can't ask a bat. You don't know what a bat thinks. So part of the answer is that I can't tell you much about the subjective experience of an ape because I'm kind of in the same family, but I'm not an ape.
Well, assume assume none of them have that kind of experience, only humans.
We don't know
What does
that.
mean?
We don't know that. That's all I'm saying.
So they'll all be in heaven when we get there.
Well, that is a belief. I can't vouch for it one way or another.
Oh, Chick, you were asking about the science portion of this, and we had that actually last year in Newberg's presentation on the functioning of the human brain or brain and the imagery that they've obtained from that. He went and he interviewed a number of very religious people when they're undergoing meditation or prayer or the like, and when these people are in an MRI or other imaging techniques, they actually see that there's certain parts of the brain that are actually activated during these times. So one would imagine that our brains work the same, whether it's a spiritual experience or not. It can be often the same experience is actually superimposed on the same part of the brain. And that these experiences were often so strong for these individuals that they were life-changing in their whole perspective of life from that point on. So just wanted to add that.
But so did that answer your question?
No.
Not completely. I'm trying to think of an ape who had a life-changing experience.
Well, I mean, so Kirk just made a suggestion. There are, now, I didn't talk about neurology. I did that in an earlier talk when we talked about consciousness, because I had plenty to talk about. But what I've found teaching is that it's tough to introduce neurology into this idea of mystical experience because it is subjective. And neurologists can look at false color maps and they can look at EEGs and they can learn all kinds of things. But they can't really get inside your head. There's some suggestion that they can because they can use AI to compare different images and they say, oh, well, these people are experiencing the same thing. They've done that with color. So there may be a way to try something like that with apes versus humans. I don't know. I'm just brainstorming.
It just seems to me that one simple solution is to say our apeness is, oh no, my brain stopped thinking. Our apeness is natural, but thinking about all these things makes us different from all the other
Yeah,
things.
so the speaker last time talked, not last time it was Jack, but before that with Jim Stump, he went on into a discussion about human exceptionalism. And, there are people that really, truly believe that humans are far and above, so different from our ape brothers that, it's not the same thing at all. I just don't have anything to say about that.
Yeah. You, in your presentation, you called Tolstoy a sick soul. I call him a realist. Yeah. So I guess I'm a sick soul too. I tend toward pessimism, particularly in the area of nuclear weapons. I think we're still on the point of the sword, Yeah. That's the way I feel about it. And you've got Putin, who I really believe would use the things. So that's my
Yeah, so there's absolutely
my worry.
nothing. Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is when those two archetypes were used by James to kind of frame the experience of people using opposites as a way of kind of, capturing them. And he didn't make any judgment about the sick soul. He considered himself a sick soul. He actually suffered from depression following the death of his small son and his father, and had to be hospitalized. He is a person that was brilliant and also torn. So it's just human to be that way. So you can be
Let me give him the
at ease.
microphone.
Yeah, on the subject of apes, I saw a news report the other day at a zoo where a young boy fell into the ape enclosure, and he was unconscious. And the ape went and picked the boy up and handed him to the trainer. So,
Because he had a spiritual experience.
so well, maybe I don't know. Maybe he had a spiritual experience, or I don't know. It might have been more than instinct, but he had an idea that that's what he should do. So I don't know.
Yeah, you could think of it as a empathic response.
Thank you. John, I wondered, did you say there's a branch of psychology called pragmatism?
It's a philosophy.
A philosophy. Oh, it's part of philosophy. So how did they come up with that term?
Pragmatism?
Yeah.
I haven't read anything about it except that James was a co-founder of it.
Yeah. I mean, I can't relate the word
Do you
pragmatism to...
John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is part of pragmatism.
Okay.
What are we actually going to do to solve problems rather than just name or names, like much of philosophy? It's how to solve problems, and that's where utilitarianism comes from.
Right.
It's the only thing Americans have contributed to the philosophical tradition.
I'll talk to your microphone. If there's no other questions, basically, for now, let's break into our discussion groups. But before that, I wanted to make sure that we have facilitators at each table, a board member who can help in the discussion. Also, I'd like to bring to mind what we're having next week. Next week, Rebecca Chamberlain will be talking on the first part of Is Earth Exceptional? Explorations into the Origin of Life. And so the first part of this will be dealing with the chemistry of what was probably involved in the formation of life. And then the following week will be looking beyond Earth to the rest of the solar system as well as the rest of the cosmos to see if a similar set of events could happen there through natural processes. So anyway, so I look forward to that too. Let's thank our speaker.